Hello, you guys hear me? Still somebody all the way in the back. It's always one. You might like it's the students that sit in the back when it's a lot of room. It's all right. We're going to be cold calling you first, since you said that.
What do you learn from the fact that you're sitting in the back?
What do I imply? I'll leave that to our distinguished speaker. So, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. It's my esteemed pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who's a good friend of mine and colleague, Miguel Unzueta from the UCLA. So Miguel is a lot of things. He's a good friend, mentor throughout this process, someone that helped me out as I was a doctoral student, kind of navigate academia. He is also the person that in 2011 convinced me to get on this thing called Twitter.com. And I think my productivity as a result after that has been just a steady downward thing, dragging me on there.
I think I ruined your life.
Kicking and screaming. No, it's been a gift and a curse. But he does fantastic research kind of in the area of inclusion, diversity, bias. And so when we needed someone to come in and kind of educate our faculty, Miguel was at the top of the list. All right, let's do the spiel here. Miguel Unzueta is Associate Professor of Management and Organizations at UCLA, Anderson School of Management. He's also a Longhorn, a Texas X. Did his bachelor's in psychology here at University of Texas at Austin. He studies diversity, bias, and discrimination, more specifically exploring how people understand their position within social and interpersonal hierarchies and the impact this understanding has on their perceptions of self, others, and group-based inequality. He's published very widely in a number of our top journals in both management and in psychology. And he was recognized by UCLA, received the Eric and E. Julian Award for Excellence in Faculty Research. He teaches in these areas and recently was named by Poets and Quants as one of the best 40 business school professors under the age of 40. And probably could have qualified for best 30 under 30 and the best 20 under 20 as well.
I have 11 months to enjoy 40 under 40.
All right, perfect.
So I'm just gonna ride with it for as long as I can.
And so outside of his academic work, Miguel also conducts training such as this with a number of companies and professional sports teams. So he really enjoys kind of blending the research with practical experience. And so I look forward to hearing his words. So without any further ado, Miguel Unzueta.
Thank you. Thank you, Sekou. Very kind introduction. Hey, also, thank you for coming. I've been at UCLA. I'm about to finish my 11th year, and I am fully aware of how valuable faculty time is. So I appreciate you all coming and basically giving an hour of your time to learn about what I think is a really important topic. The other thing I was thinking about last night, and I'm just going to put that out there, I am a product of the University of Texas, class of 2001 in psychology. So I was thinking that if you don't like my talk, I kind of feel like you only have yourselves to blame, right? Because you kind of made me. So anyway, I'm just going through these things last night as I was imagining how things might work out today. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you all about identity safety in classrooms. Like Sekou mentioned, I have an undergraduate degree here from UT in psychology. I went off to grad school at Stanford Business School right after my time here at UT. I do have a PhD from the business school at Stanford, but my advisors in the organizational behavior group at Stanford were also psychologists. So my angle on management is basically to take social psychological methods to address management-related questions. And some of the work I've been doing has been on how people understand what diversity is and what it isn't. I'll be talking about that later to the management group when I do a research talk. What I'm going to do today, though, is I'm going to walk you through some classic and some contemporary research that all has to do with the things that we can do as faculty to create classroom environments that are inclusive and inviting and that are devoid of what psychologists like to call social identity threats. And so I'll be talking a lot about what that is, some studies that have shown the power of social identity threats, and then importantly, I'm going to close with some very practical steps that we can take as faculty to try to create more inclusive classrooms. So just jumping right into it, here is the central issue that psychologists like myself who are interested in inclusivity in the classroom, this is what we're up against. The central issue is that the experience of minority students, be it women in business programs or racial minorities in general across the university, the experience of these students in these mainstream institutions, it's fundamentally different than that of majority students. What ends up happening is that people with minority identities have to cope with various social identity threats, which can lead to performance deficits, and I'll show you some data on that from classic work now in psychology. And also, importantly, it can lead to disidentification with these given fields. And so for us as teachers and as people who have power in business schools, to the extent that we're aware of what these research findings are, we can try to create and craft classroom environments that try to prevent some of this stuff from happening. And that's what I'll be talking about today. And I'll be summarizing, like I said, decades worth of research in about 45 minutes or so. So this is how I'm breaking up my talk today. I'm going to talk first about what this thing called social identity threats is. After that, I'm going to talk about the power of psychological mindsets. Part 3, I'm devoting to showing you all some brand new research on interventions in educational settings, some ideas that hopefully can make their way up to the administration in terms of things that can be done to try to eliminate some of these performance gaps. And then part 4, it's going to be all about us. It's going to be about things that we can do as faculty in the classroom. So let's jump into part 1. And let me talk about social identity threats. So to understand what a social identity threat, a couple of things to keep in mind. All of us, people, are members of a variety of different social groups, be it gender groups, racial groups, occupational groups. In a business school, I know we're always all very sensitive to what kind of training we have. Are we finance? Are we accounting? Are we management? Et cetera, et cetera. These social identities can be viewed either positively or negatively in a given context. And they can also impact your experience within that context based on that expectation. When you think an identity is devalued, people can experience what psychologists call social identity threat, which is the worry and uncertainty that you will be viewed according to this negative identity and you won't be viewed as an individual. So this is what a social identity threat is generally. One specific kind of identity threat that has been studied for about 35 years in social psychology is this phenomenon known as stereotype threat. And so what stereotype threat is, it's the added pressure that stereotyped individuals feel when they're in a situation where they think their behavior might actually prove a stereotype right. So the way this has typically been studied in psychology is you do a lot of studies in which you bring women into math settings. Math settings are contexts that are typically associated with men, and you can actually remind women of the prevalence of the stereotype, and I'll show you some data on this. That reminder of the stereotype alone can actually cause math-identified, math-able women to actually underperform. Similar effects have been found with racial minorities. I'll show you some of that data in just a couple of slides. What's particularly troubling about stereotype threat is that it's the students who are most identified with academics that are the ones that are most vulnerable to stereotype threat. So that's sort of the irony of this. It's the students that care the most and the students who are the most invested in being good students who happen to have these identities, they're the ones most vulnerable to these effects. And what psychologists argue is that stereotype threat can be so pervasive that it can cause common measures of academic competence to actually underpredict the abilities of students that belong to these stigmatized groups. So let me show you some data now. This is now considered classic research. All the stuff I'm going to show you today has been replicated, like I said, for the last 3 decades or so of psychology, and there's a very large literature on all these effects, and I'm more than happy to show them to you. Yes? So I'm going to talk about that, but that's a great question. So the idea of stereotype threat, it's not so much that you internalize the stereotype. It's not that you, as a woman in a finance class, believe that women are not good at math. It is the stereotype plays a role by you thinking that other people think this about you. So it's about what Claude Steele refers to as a threat in the air. It's just thinking that the stereotype is out there and that you could potentially be seen through that lens. And let me show you some of these data that I'm talking about here. So when researchers queue up gender-based identity threat, what they do is they recruit math-identified, math-able men and women, and they come in to do a difficult GRE-style math test. What typically happens is the researchers will describe the test. You come into the laboratory to take this test, and you're told either you're going to take a math test. That by itself is enough for women to cue up the stereotype that math is a male domain, not a female domain. You can do other things like describe the exact same test as a problem-solving task. So you kind of take away the math connotation, the stereotype saliency when you do that. And there's been other studies where people are actually taught about this thing called stereotype threat. And then you see what happens. So let me show you what some of these data suggest. So these are results from people's performance on a 30-item math, GRE-style math test. The conditions, again, you come into the lab, you recruit math-identified men and women. You think that you are either solving a problem-solving task, you're doing a math test, or you're actually doing, or you actually teach people about stereotype threat. And what you find, this is the typical stereotype threat effect. When women are taking what they think is a math test, you get underperformance relative to men. Right? So this is confirming the stereotype that men are better than math. When the exact same test is described as problem solving, that goes away. Yes?
So it looks like the men actually did better when you tell them that it's a math test. So that seems like it would almost be a positive for men to describe it that way. So how do you...
There is some work on what is known as stereotype boosting, and that is that members of positively stereotyped groups, when reminded of the stereotype, can overperform. Those effects are weaker and the effects are less robust, so that can happen. So yeah, that is an interesting sort of phenomenon in the research. It's there, but it's not as robust as a typical underperformance effect. But that's a great observation and a great question. So again, this is the typical underperformance stereotype threat situation. Same test, different students, but math identified, problem solving, the effect goes away. And then here's the power of knowledge, right? This is what's really interesting to me. There's been research now that finds that if, for example, before you take a difficult math test, you give students a short lecture like I'm doing now on what stereotype threat is, you find that people that would be vulnerable to these negative stereotypes, like women in a math context, they're no longer susceptible to that stereotype. Just anecdotally, whenever I've taught about stereotype threat to my MBA students, afterwards, I always have either an African American or a Latino student or a woman talking about math. They come up to me and they're like, thank you so much for talking about this because now I know what to call that anxiety I feel. And the issue that's going on here, of course, is that if you're trying to do a math test, you're trying to spend all your cognitive energy on answering the questions correctly, but the stereotype is hovering above you, and now you're devoting energy to try to dispel that. Well, now you're trying to do an extra thing. Right? So that's what ends up happening. It's essentially a cognitive tax that is put on people when they either can't interpret the anxiety as a stereotype threat or when the test is not labeled in a non-stereotype salient manner. So this is the effect there. That is a great question. There has been work. So the way a lot of these studies happen is you try to essentially create a test-taking situation in a laboratory. And what some researchers have done is they've manipulated the either gender group or the racial group of the person running the study. And so if you have, for example, an African-American researcher running the study, African-Americans will be less susceptible to stereotype threat because they're viewing a counter-stereotypical exemplar right in front of them. So it kind of takes the edge off. Same thing here. If a woman were running the test, even if it were called the math test, just the presence of a person that you assume has achieved at those levels, it would take the edge off the stereotype, and you probably would end up with finding similar to this, not similar to that. Yeah, the teaching intervention as well. Yeah, so basically having counter-stereotypical role models does take the edge off the stereotype for people that would otherwise be vulnerable to the stereotype. And there's some work on that. I'm happy to provide some citations if folks want to actually look at the work. This is another example of gender-based stereotype threat. So this was a study in which people came into the laboratory and they were actually given a small amount of money, and they were asked to basically gamble on themselves to be able to solve either math, logic, and reasoning tests, stereotype, threatening condition, or puzzles. Again, it's the exact same thing. It's just logic puzzles described as math and logic, which is stereotype relevant, or described as puzzles. And then what the dependent variable is, it's the number of risk-seeking versus risk-averse bets that men versus women make. And so when women are asked to make bets in the stereotype-relevant situation where they think you need math and logic abilities to succeed, you find that women are more likely to place risk-avoidant bets. Basically, they bet less on themselves. And this is consistent with the expectation that men are more comfortable taking risks, right? We always talk about entrepreneurship, and that seems to be a field that can be quite stereotyped, or at least very male-centric. When you take the exact same task and you call it a logic puzzle, a problem-solving puzzle, you eliminate that difference. Now women make equally risk-seeking bets as men because you took away the stereotypic expectation. You took away the cue of this is a male domain. Yeah, there's a ton of work on that. And yeah, there are some strong main effects that men are more risk-seeking than women. What researchers who study this topic argue is, look, there might be a bunch of reasons for why that happens out in the real world, but at least in these kind of situations, you can do something to the setup to try to either eliminate or minimize those differences in risk-seeking. So I'm not trying to argue that stereotype threat will account for every single gap that exists out there in the world. It can just account for particular gaps. In academic settings, it can account for why even highly talented, highly intellectually identified racial minority students and female students can still underperform. This is not to say that this explains everything, but it explains a part of the puzzle here. Yes? So there's some, so the question was, does the label analytics potentially either scare or turn off minority students, female students from fields? So there hasn't, I'm going to show you some data on this in a couple of slides. There hasn't been work looking at whether the word analytics has a gendered connotation to it. There has been some work looking at when you describe the necessary currency for success as being brilliance versus diligence, saying you need to be brilliant to succeed tends to attract men and detract women. So women are actually less enthusiastic about joining, say, a major or an internship when they think you need to be brilliant to succeed, because brilliance does have a connotation of maleness. Analytics, that is a great question. I do not know of any work that has looked at the sort of gendered connotation of the word analytics, but if there is a strong stereotype associated with analytics equal male, it could potentially make the thought of joining an analytics program less attractive to women. But that hasn't been done. That is a great research question. So, I mean, Sekou is more of an expert on this, but there is a phenomenon known as mimetic isoformism, where basically business schools and companies copy each other, and you see everybody start doing the same thing. And analytics became a hot word around the time Moneyball kind of blew up in the popular press, and I see every school doing it because that's what everybody's talking about. So that's probably it. The psychology of the word analytics, though, has not been studied. And you've actually given me a really good research idea, so I might be working on this when I get back to campus. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you so much. There was a hand over here, yes?
So this treats stereotype threat as kind of binary, or not, or off.
Yeah.
Certainly that's not true. And I'm thinking of our situation where we have a lot of African American students, the only person who looks like that in class. How far do you have to go in changing the environment, change stereotypes?
So it's interesting you bring up sort of being the only student of a group in a class. There is work on the fact that stereotype threat is heightened when you are the only person of a group in a class. So if I were to hold a math test and there was one woman in here, she would probably be more under stereotype threat pressure than if there were more women present. So one thing that we're doing at UCLA, for example, we have similar issues with demographics and underrepresentation that all business schools have. And this one year, I remember very clearly, I think we had an enrollment of 5 African American MBAs. And typically what happens is that each one of them would get spread out into a section. And it probably helps that our new dean of MBA and fully employed programs, she's a social psychologist herself, Margaret Shee. She knows about this research, and so what we do now is we actively avoid putting minority students and female students in token positions. So when we create study groups or learning teams, we actively avoid having 4 men, 1 woman. With racial minorities, we would rather have a section with no representation than having one person be the sole representative for that group. So to the extent that you can control how you group people, that is one thing to pay attention to avoid solo or token status.
How far away from a solo status you have to get before you have
So there is evidence that simply having another person takes the edge off. So I would say it's simply avoiding 1. When the numbers are so low, right, you can't have like a dozen or 20, but you should definitely avoid 1. So 2 might actually be enough to take the edge off some of these stereotype threat effects.
Is there any
Yes.
aspect of segregating that now we're back to, the,
Yeah.
to have separate groups for separate people?
It's certainly possible. So, I mean, I'm being very open here in the talk, but we do it very subtly. We don't tell people what exactly we're doing. And in fact, I'm going to show you some studies later on interventions to try to, like I'm saying, take the edge off these stereotypes. These interventions are so subtle that students sometimes don't even realize they're being intervened with. So there is a subtlety that is necessary. And, we don't explain what we're doing to our students. We just kind of do it. But yeah, to the extent that people realize what's happening, you can have this kind of pushback. That's where subtlety is key. So let me go through, this is some of the classic work on race-based stereotype threat. So this is work that Claude Steele, who's a psychologist, was a psychologist at Stanford, he's now at UC Berkeley, did. And so for these studies, you bring in highly academically identified black or white Stanford undergrads. All of them care about being smart. All of them care about being good students. And what you do is you give them a difficult GRE-style test. And in this particular study, the manipulation of the stereotype was very subtle. You simply give people either a demographic sheet before they take a test or no demographic sheet before they take a test. And the act of simply checking off your race for black students actually caused an underperformance. When there was no demographic sheet, you find that the performance was the same across groups. Similarly, also black and white identified students, if you tell students that the test they're about to take is an intelligence test, that cues up stereotype threat, which makes black students underperform. You say it's diagnostic of intelligence. When you tell them this is a test, it's not actually diagnostic of intelligence, it's just a test, you find the effect goes away, right? So again, either diagnosticity or reminders of your racial group before you take a test actually create the gap that, it's creating the racial gap here. Other types of stereotype threat, some of you already asked me some of these, so I'm going to skip through these. Certain environmental cues can make the stereotype threat worse. So when you're by yourself, where you're the only woman taking a math test, you're the only racial minority in a context, that can make the stereotype more salient. You're more likely to underperform. This was brought up earlier. When the person running the experiment belongs to the stigmatized group, that actually makes the stereotype threat situation less impactful on students. These stereotypes, it's not about internalization. That's what stereotype threat researchers always argue. It's not about you believing the stereotype it's true. It's you believing other people hold the stereotype and then you potentially proving it right. So it's not that you have to believe it. And the way researchers are able to tease that apart, you can actually get white men to underperform on a math test by reminding them of the Asians are good at math stereotype. So it's not that you have to believe it, it's just a reminder of what the stereotype is, and you can even get white men to underperform on a math test by bringing up that stereotype. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so the question is, how do you think about or classify international students? I mean, from a stereotype threat perspective, I would say that international students could be susceptible to stereotype threat if you can find the context in which their internationalness has a negative connotation. So maybe in a writing task or a communication task, emphasizing their foreignness might actually make them perform worse. In terms of the classification, I mean, I'm more than happy to chat about that afterwards. That is a complex question, and it's a little bit beyond what I'm talking about here. But I'm happy to chat afterwards if you have a few minutes. Right, so I talked about white men on math. This is one of my favorite studies. Jeff Stone, psychologist at the University of Arizona, he creates kind of like a mini golf situation in his lab, kind of like Peter Pan golf on South Lamar. The big dinosaur, you guys got it? Anyway, he creates a sort of a mini golf 9-hole thing in his laboratory. He brings in black and white University of Arizona undergraduates, and he tells them that he and his research team have discovered that your ability to perform well at this mini golf course is evidence of either your athletic intelligence or your athletic ability. And what he ends up finding when white students are putting and they think it's about athletic intelligence, they outperform black students by about 3 strokes. When they think it's about athletic ability, the black students do better than the white students, right? So it's simply the expectation, the stereotype, right? The whole idea that whites are less athletic than African Americans. That stereotype can actually cause the anxiety among students, and they actually end up doing worse on this created mini golf course. The implications to stereotype threat, of course, are huge. One of the major ones is that if you are a student that is constantly experiencing stereotype threat, right? You're constantly feeling like, I need to do well, not only for myself, but also to prove the stereotype wrong. Over a course of years, that could start weighing heavily on you. And so what ends up happening is that students end up potentially moving away from fields in which the stereotype threat is felt. And that might partially explain why you end up with women moving away from quantitative fields, or racial minorities in general moving away from academic domains. I'm not saying this is the only reason this happens, but it could be one, right? And understanding the psychology of people from underrepresented groups is incredibly important because it gives you a window into the extra tax that they're having to pay just to try to survive and make it in these kinds of environments. In terms of minimizing stereotype threat, there's been a lot of work on what researchers call identity-safe environments. And some of the implications here are relatively straightforward, right? So having reminders in the environment of things that cue up negative aspects of identities can actually create stereotype threat. Paul Davies, who is a former colleague of mine, who used to teach at UCLA, he has this one great study where he brought in undergraduate women at UCLA, and he tells them that they're there to do 2 studies. The first study is to get their reactions to advertisements and TV commercials. The second study, he tells them, it's a little survey on career aspirations. When they see those television commercials, you're either randomly assigned to a control condition where you see kind of random generic TV commercials. You're assigned to a stereotype threat condition in which you see commercials that play on the kind of the dumb blonde stereotype. So the idea that women are not as smart as men. These are sort of humorous commercials. But he was curious to see if being exposed to the stereotype in this indirect way through a media message, would that impact your career aspirations? And what he finds is that women exposed to this ad actually reports less interest in leadership roles immediately after seeing that ad, right? So this is not about underperformance. It's actually about your imagined self now being shifted, where you're like, oh, so, and again, it's subtle. They're not fully aware, but it just makes the idea of joining leadership roles less attractive for women. I talked about this earlier. Knowledge is key. Simply knowing about stereotype threat, having a label to give these feelings of anxiety can sometimes be enough to overcome it. Having role models who belong to basically to your stigmatized group in these positions can also be a way to minimize stereotype threat. Avoiding solo representation, we talked about that earlier. And then what I want to talk about next is the psychology of mindsets. And that's part 2 of my talk. So what are mindsets? So mindsets are cognitive orientations that shape your entire social world. They capture fundamental assumptions about human nature, and they dictate your goals and performance contexts. And importantly, in educational settings, certain mindsets can inhibit and also aid in learning. So this little graph kind of defines the main differences in the kinds of mindsets I'm talking about. So the way researchers would actually capture your endorsement of either mindsets, there is a well-established mindset scale where you simply ask students to answer on a Likert scale from 1 to 7, a bunch of items about their assumptions about what any given ability is. So for this, let me walk you through this graph using, so Sekou just got tenure, so this might be relevant to you. After I got tenure in 2012, I decided that I was going to learn how to play the guitar. That was my treat to myself for years of hard work and making it through the process. But I constantly struggle with my own thinking about where guitar skill come from. Is it about working at it, or is it about just being born a naturally gifted guitarist? And so I constantly struggle between growth and fixed mindset. So when I'm in a fixed mindset about guitar, I assume that you're either born a good guitarist or you're not. Whenever I'm in that mindset, I start thinking that, well, if my hands were bigger, I'd be a better guitarist. You know, Stevie Ray Vaughan was a huge guy, and he was just born that way, and I wasn't. So it is what it is. When I'm in a growth mindset, though, I start thinking, oh, actually, guitar playing, it's just really about working at it and getting better and just improving. Fixed and growth mindsets impact what you think effort is all about. So when I'm in the fixed mindset, if I have to practice really hard to play scales, it's because I'm not a good guitar player. When I'm in the growth mindset, suddenly it's like, no, doing scales and practice, that's the only way you improve, right? So it's kind of effort is the currency to get better versus if you have to work hard, it's because you're not good at it. It can also impact motivation. So when I'm in a more fixed mindset, I kind of want to show off to my wife that I can play these 3-chord songs. When I'm in a growth mindset, it's not about performance. It's just about me getting better and taking satisfaction in my own improvement and the fact that I can play a 3-chord song even if I'm only playing it for myself. It can also impact how you respond to failure. So if I'm in a fixed mindset about the guitar and I'm struggling with a complicated chord shape or a bar chord, I'm like, well, this clearly is evidence that I just shouldn't be doing this. I should give up. In a growth mindset, it's like, no. So I'm bad at bar chords. I'm bad at these shapes. Now I have to attack these specifically to get better at them. That would be the growth mindset version. And then also the meaning of failure. Whenever I have failures and struggles, if you're in a fixed mindset, failure means stop, do something else. If you're in a growth mindset, failure means attack that directly, and that's what you do. So I gave you kind of a silly example about me trying to learn how to give guitar, but now imagine you have these assumptions about intelligence or about math ability. And that's going to have a significant impact on students in how they react to their struggles in academic settings. So this is sort of typical of what a lot of these mindset intervention studies have shown. So this is data collected with middle school students. And the general pattern for middle school student math performance is that they actually do worse as the year goes on. As the material gets harder, they actually end up doing worse. And so there was a randomized experiment run in which students were either randomly assigned to take math study skills classes, and what you see is that students who were given study skills, their performance declines like normal. This other condition up here were students who received study skills classes, but in addition to that, they received growth mindset training so that they could think about intelligence as this, right? So math ability is something that you develop. Intelligence, and specifically math ability, it's like a muscle. The more you work it out, the stronger it'll get. And what you find, and this is typical of growth mindset interventions, when people are equipped with a growth mindset, suddenly the study skills classes actually work for them. And importantly, when you actually survey these students after the growth mindset seminar, they start viewing failures as not evidence that they should quit and not try hard, but they view it as a challenge. Now it's like, okay, now it's on. I struggled in algebra. I'm going to work a little bit harder so I can come back and do better. It might be, except that these students also had a teacher intervening. It's just that the content they taught was devoid of the growth mindset effect. But yeah, I know what you're saying. Like just having any kind of change might lead. So there were teachers for them and for them. It's just the content is what differed. Yes.
Why is even the experimental group are worse at the end than they were at the beginning?
Yeah, so there's actually a long literature in education about this. You find that as the material gets harder, students do worse, and there is an erosion of math skill throughout a school year. That's my understanding of what that literature suggests. And again, these are...
The kids get dumber every year.
That's...
That's hard to believe.
Well, this is GPA. So you could argue that, well, as the content gets harder, the GPA gets lower. Yeah, it's GPA. So I'm hoping that they know more, even though their grades might be slipping. That's what I hope happens. So, and again, I want to emphasize this, why growth and fixed mindsets matter. How you interpret hard work is at the core of it here. So when you're in a fixed mindset, you end up with people attributing hard work or interpreting hard work as this. So this is a quote from a qualitative study that looked at just the differences between growth and fixed mindset students. Fixed mindset students, they think of hard work as evidence that they're not good at something. Growth mindset students, on the other hand, they think of work as the currency you need to spend to actually get better, right? So this is why this matters. Your interpretation of work changes. There's been a bunch of other more laboratory-based experiments, which I find really fascinating, in which you set people up to fail. So the way this works, you come in and you're going to take three sort of not intelligence, but like puzzle logic type of tests. The first one is medium hard, so everybody can do well on it. And what the researchers do is what they're trying to do in these studies is psychologically prime you to either think of yourself as being fixed intelligent or growth diligent, right? So what happens is you come in, you perform on this test, you're given feedback, something like this. This is an oversimplification, but this is basically what happens. You're given either fixed feedback, which says, you did really well. This must mean you're really smart. If you're in the growth condition, you're told, you did really well. You must have worked really hard. Then you're told, you're going to do another one. What the researchers do is for the second trial, they make that very hard to nearly impossible so that everybody fails. So you take it, you fail, and you're told, oh, you didn't do well, you failed. No feedback. The feedback was already given about intelligence or effort. And then after that, you're given a third trial that goes back to being medium difficulty. And the question becomes, how do students react based on the kind of feedback they got on the first trial? And this summarizes the general trend in this work. So basically, students who were given the growth mindset feedback, you must have worked really hard, they report enjoying the activity more than fixed mindset students after failure. And then importantly, they end up performing better than students in the fixed mindset feedback. So for them, having failed isn't evidence that I'm dumb. It's not evidence that I don't belong here. It's evidence that I got to work a little bit harder, right? So that's the power of these mindsets. It changes your interpretation of struggles. It changes your interpretation of failure such that failure is a starting point, not the end. Yes? Yeah. I think so. I mean, I'm going to show you some data right now, and this is where we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the analytics question that you brought up. I have noticed, and again, these are all just my own anecdotal observations, but I have noticed that some of my colleagues are always very interested in talking about which of their doctoral students are brilliant versus not. And to the extent that you're looking for brilliance, that to me, it's almost a fixed mindset prime, right? Versus trying to emphasize the fact that, you know, everybody can be successful if you're willing to put in the work. So I think to the extent that you emphasize the need for brilliance, that could be a subtle cue that is putting people in a fixed mindset. And in fact, let me show you what this new work suggests. So this is work, it's a paper, brand new paper. It's about to come out in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, which is one of the top psych journals out there. It actually includes a former UT alum as an author, Mary Murphy. She's a class of 2001 psych major like myself. She's now a professor at the University of Indiana. And also, this is probably too much information, Mary also went off to Stanford. She was in psych, and I was in the business school. So just another UT connection, since I'm here with the home crowd. So this paper was looking at the idea that describing majors as requiring brilliance versus diligence might have this gendered connotation, such that brilliance equal men, and therefore men might react more positively towards framing of majors and internships that are described as requiring brilliance. And this is what this paper finds. So these are results from 4 studies. Students were asked to indicate their interest in an internship, an unspecified major, a STEM engineering major, or a social science humanity major. And the manipulation was simply telling them that in order to be successful in this field, you need either dedication or you need brilliance. And the pattern was pretty stark. Women react more positively to framings of dedication. Men react more positively to framings of brilliance. And so what Mary Murphy and her colleagues argue is that this brilliance obsession that is out there in the world might have this gendered connotation, which might be queuing up a social identity threat that actually is turning women off from pursuing these fields. There's another fascinating piece that came out in Scientific American. I actually have the citation for you all at the end in case you want to look it up and read it. This was a survey done of professors in a wide range of fields, from psychology to earth science to Spanish to art history. They basically survey people like us, professors. And the question was simple: to what extent do you need brilliance and genius to become a star in your field? And what the researchers find is that the more field practitioners endorse the concept of brilliance, the fewer PhDs their field tends to grant to racial minorities and women. It's a correlational study. I'm not trying to argue that correlation is causation. I learned that at UT when I was an undergrad. I know that for sure. However, these kinds of correlational findings, coupled with these experimental findings, it just brings up the point that certain kinds of feedback, certain obsessions with brilliance, not only is it putting students in a fixed mindset, there might be a gendered connotation that's actually turning people away before they even try to enter the field. Right? So that's why this stuff matters. Yes? Yeah.
That's something that
Yeah.
is not a matter of effort.
Yeah. So it's funny you bring up creativity. So I teach negotiations at UCLA, and there's actually been a lot of work on growth and fixed mindsets in negotiation. And one thing that has been shown is that if you emphasize the creativity necessary to make deals happen in negotiations, that usually ends up working better for women who are typically stigmatized as not being aggressive and competitive like men. So emphasizing creativity has less of an identity threat. Now, whether or not you think creativity, you either have it or you don't, that is sort of putting it more in a fixed versus growth mindset. I mean, I would argue that the more experienced you become in a field, the more you see what creativity looks like in your field, and maybe you start figuring things out. I know I certainly am more creative now, 12 years into my job, than I was when I started, just because I've read a whole lot more. And I've seen a bunch of researchers present all sorts of topics with different data sets, and now I'm like, oh, these are all tools. And for me personally, the more tools I learn, the more things I can do, which I would argue is boosting up my creativity. So anyway, yeah, but it's funny you bring up creativity. Creativity does have less of a gendered connotation, and at least in negotiation settings, that can actually help women not underperform versus thinking it's all about just being aggressive. Yes? Yeah. I mean, that's a little bit of an incentive question, just because, to the extent that ratings and rankings factor these things in, I mean, people obviously want to talk about how high their SAT and their GRE scores are. I mean, to the extent that you start believing that GRE and SAT are a 100% accurate signal of intelligence, that could be queuing up some of these identity threats that I'm talking about. So I would call for a more nuanced understanding of what these scores are. They're certainly capturing something about your intellectual ability, but there's all sorts of other social cultural factors that play into who does well and who doesn't do well on those tests, including stereotype threat. So I'm not going to say good or bad. I'm going to say a more nuanced understanding is what's necessary. That's a very academic answer. I've been doing this job for too long. Yeah. I mean, so I understand the sort of the external pressure to try to match up to some of these other programs. I mean, what I would say is, do we know for sure that these scores are predicting things you care about once people are in the program? If they're not exactly doing that, then if it is turning people off, perhaps a de-emphasis might be good to maybe try to diversify the applicant pool for the program you're talking about. Arthur?
So at the undergraduate level, what we know is that we emphasize SAT scores as part of the admission process more, we get more math. And we emphasize class time in high school, we get more math. So I think
Interesting.
some perception there. We also look at it because we need that mindset in my class.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, and so what psychologists would say is that all these things, right, how you frame it, be it ranking or SAT or whatever it is, that's queuing up certain social identity contingencies and threats, which is causing these differences, which is akin to what this work is showing, right? So I think awareness of sort of the underlying ideas and then an interpretation of what you're doing given this would be really useful in terms of developing a rationale for certain framings versus not. Yes?
It sounds like a good point. There's kind of 2 points in time as well. There's the admissions question, which is one issue. But there's also, we get them all in front of us at orientation, right? And we don't use the word brilliant, but we pretty much spit the other word out.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting point that, we should probably change how we describe it
Yeah.
so that we're talking about the effort that they put in
Yeah.
to get there.
Yeah.
And the resilience that they brought
And-
to being there. That's why we chose the accountability.
And I think what's interesting too, right? It's objectively true that people have to work really hard to end up in a business program like this at McCombs. But it's the emphasis that we give to either the brilliance or the work that could actually lead to these positive downstream consequences that might actually equalize performance.
Particularly relevant for our underrepresented minorities.
Absolutely.
Who are
Absolutely.
coming out of school sometimes where they don't have the
Absolutely.
academic opportunities.
Absolutely.
But they've shown through their
Yeah.
resilience and effort that they belong.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this is obviously a research talk, but since I am here with the home crowd, I can tell you that 20 years ago when I was a freshman, a lot of these things that I'm talking about right now were things that were just occupying my mind. And of course, I was an 18-year-old kid, first-generation college student from El Paso, Texas. I didn't quite have all these tools. Fortunately, I discovered this field and this research pretty early on, so I was able to kind of reinterpret things for myself. But I can tell you that this stuff is real, as a person who has lived through it, not only here at UT, but also at Stanford in my PhD program. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. It's also a way of highlighting just all the expertise that are present in a given classroom so that it doesn't become like, well, it's only the math jocks that are the ones that are going to be valued. Rather, it's all of us have a very unique background before we come to business school, and it could be useful in all of these contexts, especially when you're trying to put it all together and pitch a startup or pitch a research idea, right? It's everything. It's quant, it's the qualitative, it's everything coming at one. So I want to talk to you all about some recent research on interventions, and I'm going to just talk about two intervention studies that I think are really interesting. What these interventions share in terms of characteristics of the intervention, this is what tends to make for a good intellectual intervention. So effective interventions target students' subjective interpretation of reality. So this is why this is so important to understand what female students in quant context and racial minority students in academic context experience. It's a subjective interpretation of the world that all of us are seeing, but we're feeling it differently. So all these interventions are sensitive to the fact that it's perception that becomes reality for these students. The second characteristic of a good intervention, the methods for intervening are subtle, if not stealthy. So it's not that you're bringing at-risk students to take a calculus refresher course, you figure out ways to kind of subtly intervene without them even realizing what's going on. I'll give you some examples of that in a bit. And then also importantly, these interventions tap into self-reinforcing processes that students can kind of go back to that well to constantly reinterpret reality for themselves. So let me show you what some of these interventions look like. There's a growing body of research now using what we in psychology know or call a self-affirmation intervention. There's actually a long literature on self-affirmation theory, and the broader theory around self-affirmation is that humans are motivated to maintain an overall positive view of the self. You just want to maintain a view of yourself as having integrity and sort of viewing yourself positively. What this means is that if I'm able to remind you of a core value that matters to you, and you're able to remind yourself of it by, say, writing a short essay, that writing exercise serves to self-affirm you. And when you're self-affirmed, what that does is it allows you to think of yourself in a more holistic way, in a more complete way. And what research finds is that when you are self-affirmed, specific threats to you don't sting as badly. So self-affirmation research, I've actually used it in my own work, but there's been other work in health psychology, which I think is fascinating. So they use self-affirmation to get undergraduate students to admit that they'd engaged in unsafe sexual practices. And so what was happening is that there would be all these surveys passed out asking students to what extent they engaged in unsafe sexual practices. Basically, condom use is the dependent variable. What you found is that students were underreporting the actual amount of unsafe sex they'd engaged in. When you gave students a self-affirmation before you gave them the survey, suddenly you found more students admitting that they'd engaged in this. And then importantly, because it was no longer threatening to admit you did something you should not have done, these students also committed themselves to not doing that in the future. And when you follow up with them a year later, you actually find that their rate of unsafe sex continues to be down. So the idea is admitting that you made these mistakes is threatening, so you lie, and then you pretend it didn't happen, and you don't change your behavior. But when you're self-affirmed, this admission is no longer threatening. You admit you made the mistake, you commit to changing your behavior, and then you actually do your behavior. And these self-affirmations work by making self-threats less impactful, and they also curtail your defensiveness to them. So that was a health psychology outcome that I talked about. And this is sort of what happens. So the manipulation is simple. You would have students, the prompt is simple, is you simply ask students to write a short essay on a core value they have and why it matters to them. The control condition would be either no essay writing at all, or you have students write about a core value that matters to somebody else but not you. Right? That would be a non-self-affirmed manipulation. When you ask students to write about core values, you usually get stuff like this. Students write about how important friendship and family is to them, how cherishing your family is so important. People write about religious values and how that matters to them. This student down here wrote about how important it is to be funny and to have a sense of humor. Again, you're writing about things that are core to you, and the psychology of it is now you're seeing yourself in a more holistic, more expansive way. Specific threats don't hurt as much. In an academic setting, which is why we're here. Oh, sorry, go ahead. This stuff here, or so this comes from a paper by Jeff Cohen and David Sherman. I actually have a citation for you at the end. It's oh, because they're referencing that? Yeah, so this comes from a review they did on self-affirmation research, and I just took this out of the paper to give you an example of what these responses look like. Yeah. Yeah, so it's funny you say Cohen is at University of Colorado, so very perceptive. Okay, well, go Buffaloes. All right, so this is a study done by Sherman and Cohen that I just mentioned. What they did here, these were black and white middle school students. Before the study began, they divided up the students for statistical purposes as either being high-performing or low-performing. There's not anything going on with the students that already had high GPAs and were high-performing. There were no race differences, and the affirmation condition did nothing. The way the study works is at the beginning of the school year, all students are asked to engage in a self-affirmation writing task, like this kind of stuff. And then throughout the school year, they're basically given shorter affirmation primes to sort of re-emphasize which condition they're in. It's a double-blind study, so the students have no idea what's happening. They're just writing these little essays. What you find is that among the low-performing African-American students, those that were in the self-affirmation condition, they actually end up performing better than their peers in the control condition. And the psychology of this is that for these students, they're on the lower end of the distribution in terms of academic achievement. For them, being in school and failing often, can be quite threatening. But when you're able to self-affirm, suddenly the edge of those negative grades goes away, and now you're more likely to actually view them as feedback. Or you're more likely to listen to your teacher who is telling you, this is the mistake you made, fix it. And you end up with a significant boost among the low-performing students. A similar study has replicated this effect. This was a school that had a significant white Latino performance gap, and it's a similar type of pattern. Among the lower-performing Latino students, you find that Latino students who were in the self-affirmation condition, basically they were asked to write short essays on core values throughout the school year, they actually perform better academically. And again, the students have no idea this is happening. This is happening almost blind to them. So these were some self-affirmation interventions. So something that we are talking about doing at UCLA right now, we have a pre-term class where all of our MBA students get together. We actually do have an essay assignment in which students are asked to write essentially a plan for how they expect the next 2 years of their business school experience to work out. What we're trying to do now is work in a prompt about their core values and how their core values might express themselves in the MBA program throughout the 2 years. So it's a subtle intervention. Everybody's exposed to it. But what we hope happens is that it targets students who might be particularly threatened by the academic environment in the MBA program. Let me talk about this other intervention, and then I'll get to the what we can do, and I'll make sure that we're out of here. I have until 45 past the hour. Is that right? Okay. Sorry. We'll be out of here by then. All right. So this was another interesting study in which it was targeted to first-year undergraduate students at a highly competitive undergraduate institution. They recruit black and white students. And the issue that was trying to be addressed here is that oftentimes undergraduate students, in particular minority students, when they first get to college, they have this very strong concern that they may not belong in college, right? Do I actually fit in? Am I going to make it? These kinds of concerns. And so what the researchers did is they recruit students. All of them are highly competent and highly motivated to succeed. They randomly assign them to interventions in which they learn that all first-year students go through this, but that eventually they basically grow out of it and get better, or they're assigned to a control condition in which they learn about unrelated aspects about the college transition process, a more technical kind of seminar. And what the researchers do is they have an intervention at the beginning. You get randomly assigned to either learn that eventually not belonging concerns go away, or you learn about other technical aspects of college. And then students are surveyed for the next 3 years while in college, online surveys that are quick to do. And there's a few refresher seminars that happens throughout the next 3 years to re-emphasize the conditions students were put in. Let me just get to the findings. So this is what is particularly important here. So this was a measure of how uncertain you felt about your belonging. And what you find is that black students who were in the social belonging treatment condition, where they were taught that eventually these feelings of not belonging would dissipate, they actually report less concern about not belonging. And the way the intervention worked is the students come in and they watch videos of older students like them talking about how they at first were insecure, but they eventually got better. And then, this is part of the cleverness of the intervention, the researchers have the students write out quickly what the point of the video was, and then the students are told that they eventually will be asked to themselves film videos for other younger students. So it's clever and subtle in that the subjects being intervened with are actually being convinced that they are teachers, not subjects. Right? So that's what's clever about these studies. And you find that the uncertainty goes down for treated African American students. Psychologists have these subtle measures to assess stereotype accessibility. You basically find black students who are in the social belonging condition were less likely to think of race-based stereotypes in the academic environment. And then also feelings of self-doubt. You find that the treated black students reported lower feelings of self-doubt. They also tracked GPA. The important line here is this line here with the X's. What you find is that the treated African American students outperformed the control group African American students, and the GPA gap between black and white students at this university among this sample was actually cut in half. It still remained, but it was actually halved by simply reassuring students that these feelings they're having will eventually go away. It's not something about you and you don't belong, it's something that everybody goes through. So here's a summary of what this study suggests, right? The key is the intervention is changing what feeling like I don't belong does to black students. It's changing the interpretation such that when they feel like they're struggling, it's not because I don't belong here, it's just because I'm a college student, and that's just what happens. And having that tool, having that subtle reinterpretation is key for these students to actually be able to navigate this stressful environment. And essentially, these students are able to kind of protect themselves from stereotype threat by having these reminders of the fact that eventually things will go away. Subtle messages of not belonging. So I've struggled with some of these issues in my own classroom. I've made a bunch of mistakes. Sometimes it's things that I've done and I realize that I just should not have done them. Sometimes I'm not paying attention. And so this happened about a year ago. One of my students ends up, she decides to be entrepreneurial, and what she does is she grabs all of her core syllabi from the first year MBA program at UCLA, 2016 to 2017. And she went through and she content coded the demographics of the characters in the cases, in the MBA cases. And what she found, to me, was startling. She found that only 16% of the cases that the MBA students learned in their first year featured a woman protagonist. And importantly, over half of our cases didn't feature a single woman in them. So these were cases that were just men doing business, no women represented whatsoever. You know, it's funny. I actually, and I have a list that I'm going to circulate among you all as well. So me and some colleagues put together a list of cases that feature women. And these are usually newer, more updated cases than some of the old classic ones. But I actually contacted Harvard Business School to try to get a sense of the demographics, and they either don't have or don't want to release the statistics on this. They've been a little bit slow in addressing this. And I get it. Look, I'm a teacher too. I'm trying to teach my content, right? I'm not paying attention to absolutely everything happening in the course. There's some cases I love. They're old school, but they make great points. So it's like, why do I have to change? But I hope that now that we're sort of thinking about identity threats, we're thinking about stereotype threats, you see the importance of having our students actually see themselves out there in the world that we want them to occupy once they leave with a McCombs MBA or with an Anderson MBA. Yes?
It's not just this, right? It's every business school that you walk in. We don't have any pictures here, but at work we have huge pictures.
Sure.
All the time. But even if it's not pictures, it's just white and everything. And it's
Yeah.
really all you see.
Yeah.
We have on the wall. We do have some pictures that we do with clothes.
Yeah.
And it's just mostly the same kind of looking people.
Yeah.
And so, to me, that's obvious, but
Yeah.
I don't know who's listening. I mean, if anybody would ask me, I would tell them.
Yeah.
But I mean, part of it is, I'm guessing almost every woman who goes through the MBA program notices this.
Yeah. Yeah.
She probably had a couple glasses of wine, not really out, it's out there, decided to show you, right?
So what's funny to me is when my student told me she was doing this, I was like, well, I think I know where you're going to find. But these are graphs that she produced, and actually going around Anderson showing this to my colleagues, it's gotten people to realize that, oh, well, that's probably not right, huh? And then what we and some of my colleagues did is like, oh, and by the way, here's a list we compiled of a bunch of cases that you can use to update your courses. So it's sort of a win-win situation.
I think it's great that you're doing that. I just think,
Yeah.
sometimes this one is not lost, right?
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't we notice this before? It's not
Yeah.
keeping them all up.
Yeah. No,
These pictures all up on the wall all the time.
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, and none of these interventions or anything I'm talking about, I'm not saying these will solve everything, but I think to the extent that we now have a logic for explaining why these things matter, it might give us a rationale for making some
And I
changes.
think it's great, and it's great that you did it, it's great that
Yeah.
you're addressing it.
Yeah.
And it's not just that, it's the
Yeah.
brochures,
Yeah.
it's all of it, and I think in order to fix it,
It's a more cultural thing, yes.
all of you have to know these things, right? It's not people are
Yeah.
power, but if someone wanted to, if they were an expert, they could go look at all of them, look at
Yep.
everybody on the wall,
Yep.
look at everybody in the brochures,
Yep.
everybody in the cases, and
I think to be fair, they did an article that gone to some institute because of the classes that are more. So, what we do too. I'm the only one who's perfect.
I
Yes.
belong to one obvious minority, but the rest of my identity classification falls square into it.
Sure.
Right? I mean, so what do we
Sure.
do with, I mean, we're trying to be subtle, we're trying to be stealthy,
Yeah.
to be aware of some of these things that I just can't identify with because I've never experienced them without trying to be like, so, Sekou, tell me what it's like to be the only
Yeah.
African American in the room, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
how do you do that?
Yeah.
I mean, or
Yeah.
is that something that we
Yeah.
should do, right? I mean, trying to be
I mean, well, I think among colleagues, I'm more than happy to talk about my experience as being, I mean, I was one of two underrepresented minorities at Stanford graduate program. We had 90 students total, and it was me and this other student who were underrepresented minorities. I am perfectly willing to talk about what the experience is like so that people can gain a better sensitivity about it. So I think the fact that you talk about belonging to one group, to the extent that you're able to empathize given those issues, hopefully that creates empathy for other dimensions as well. And then also, again, I think what's important is the language and a rationale so that we're able to talk about why these things matter from an intellectual perspective. What oftentimes is being battled is people being like, that's just political correctness, whatever. And it's like, look, it's not just political correctness because these things have impacts. And these things self-perpetuate gaps that none of us want. So I think having a language and a frame to talk about these things is very important. There's this great quote that I came across by Anne Rich. She's a poet and an essayist, so she's much more eloquent than psychologists are. But I think she's essentially talking about identity threats. She says, when those who have the power to name and socially construct reality choose not to see you, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. So I thought that was an incredibly eloquent way of talking about what happens when you're erased from cases, what happens when you're erased from curricula. This is the psychology of that. So what can we do? Based on everything I talked about, based on my own surveys of colleagues at other business schools who have done seminars like this, these are just a bunch of things that I came up with for faculty to try. So monitoring how we're calling on people. I have this bad habit where I initially, when I started teaching, it would be purely volunteer-based. And I very quickly noticed that 10 students would dominate the entire conversation. Oftentimes, international students and female students were left out of the conversation. So I've changed that. I'm basically forcing myself to cold call students. And I have my TA monitor who's gotten cold called and who hasn't. I basically want to share the misery of being cold called with everybody in my classroom. Yeah. I mean, that's a possibility, but also, I mean, I'm sure you have colleagues here who are adamant supporters of cold calling. I mean, I would talk to them to figure out how they've navigated some of these issues. For me, with cold calling, it just sets up the expectation that you're supposed to have read the case and you're supposed to be ready to chime in. Not everything's going to be brilliant, but there I go, putting out a fixed mindset word. Not every comment is going to be the most insightful comment out there in the world, but I just expect everybody to be ready to jump into this. Sekou?
We can talk more about this, but you can do kind of this warm calling or cool calling, let's say. You pretty much say, these are people who are probably going to be called on the next class, and they can prepare. And that way, they don't know which of the 5 that you noted are going to be called, but
That's
they're
good.
going to be called. You
Yeah.
can kind of do that. It's just more effort on your side to
Yeah.
divvy that up, keep track of it.
And what I would say, too, is make sure you're using your TAs to help you do this, right? I understand we're trying to teach content. The TA, though, they have a little bit more resources to monitor participation and help you do the warm calling. Problem-solving aspects of coursework, like I said earlier in my negotiation class, I try to overemphasize the fact that negotiations are joint problems to be solved. There are competitive pressures within them, but I don't frame my negotiations as who won, who lost. It's more like, were you able to come up with integrative solutions? And I find that makes students who are anxious about negotiating more comfortable, and it just so happens that a lot of those students happen to be female. Update your cases, I just talked about that. If you're trying to be inclusive, then actually include. Ask people outright for preferred names. Ask them how to pronounce their names correctly. Know the current accepted terms for different groups. Be mindful of diversity when you're using pronouns, right? If all of your examples of leaders are he and him, that could be problematic. Avoid jokes that reinforce stereotypes. Guest speakers, right? Guest speakers are great. Students love them, but let's ensure that we're recruiting speakers from a diverse network, from a wide range of industries. Take into account that examples that you bring up might not be as universal as you think. I have a terrible habit, and I'll admit it with you all. I love sports. I am a sports nerd, a stats sports nerd, and I love talking about sports to sort of elucidate other concepts in management. But I've realized that that basically is good for about 15% of my class. And a bunch of students are like, why is this guy talking about Golden Glove Awards in the American League in 1999? Even though that's a great example that I have for the availability bias. We can talk about that offline. So I forced myself to come up with examples that are more business relevant and less dependent on this esoteric knowledge of sports, which I happen to have given my own background. And feedback, of course, make sure students feel comfortable talking to you about diversity-related concerns. For the administration, self-affirmation interventions. Can you get students to fill out core value essays at a time when everybody is together? Study skills and boot camp classes, especially those that happen in the preterm. Is there reading or an emphasis on growth versus fixed mindsets? When creating study groups, learning teams, and sections, are you doing it in a way to try to avoid tokenism, to try to avoid solo representation? We didn't really talk about this, but eliminating student names from tests and just you doing it based on ID, that's a way to guard against potentially queuing up stereotype threat and also bias on the grader side. At UCLA, they started doing this. They added this question to end-of-class evaluations. To what extent did the instructor contribute to creating an inclusive environment? What gets measured gets acted upon, right? So that's a newer thing. I don't know what the results have been, but it's a way of signaling to students that the university cares about these matters. Bunch of stuff to read. I actually got all these articles to Raji, but I'm more than happy to get them to other folks if people are curious. All these can be found online if you just search for them. This one up here I think is particularly interesting, especially for those of you who teach content that doesn't have a sort of an obvious diversity angle. It's just a great piece to get you thinking about all the classroom dynamics that you as a professor are shaping. So that's a really great one. And it's short, too. I know you talked about time being a concern. That's a great piece to read. The rest are more academic, but I strongly encourage you all to look at this. There's been some great books on interventions in psychology and education. These are three of my favorites on this topic. This is one that I've actually given to undergrads whenever a first-generation student comes talk to me. I always I try to have spare copies of Mindset to just give to them. So these are also great reads. Newer book. This is Claude Steele, basically summarizing 30 years of stereotype threat research in one book. These are all the folks that helped me put this slide deck together. I want to thank you all for coming. On a personal side, 20 years ago, I was finishing out my freshman year at UT, and I had no idea how my life was going to unfold. So for that kid to learn that this is happening 2 decades later, I can't tell you how happy and how proud that makes me. So I want to thank you all for making this event happen. And any thoughts or questions, I am always available to chat. So thank you all very much.